You claim that that the Sesame Street characters are Muppets.
No, he does not.
No, Andres does, but his proof only exists because there was some sort of hidden closet somewhere in some museum that Jim Henson had, and there were Muppets strewn in the closet all about with Sesame Street characters.
Right.
It doesn't mean that they're the same just because he made them both.
I think I found something that supported my point, and you don't like it.
Chronicles of Narnia was written by C.S. Lewis, but C.S. Lewis also wrote this whole like space adventure series.
It's horrible. I hated it.
They're not the same just because he invented both.
But did they feature?
Yeah, was Aslan in space?
Right.
If Aslan was in space, would they have been part of the same Chronicles?
So, but were there? But at points,
because Kermit's in both.
Right.
He's a crossover character.
Right.
So you have to
Thus,
at least
same
acknowledge
universe.
that they are
Spider-Verse.
Does that mean that Kermit is Aslan in the Muppet universe?
Yes, and then Miss Piggy is the witch.
Oh, that
No,
I can
because
agree with. No.
Kermit and Miss Piggy have some sort of weird like love thing going
Yeah,
on.
they do.
And in one movie they have children, don't they?
I believe
No.
so. Yeah, I believe so.
No.
Yeah.
Yes.
Froglets, piglets, what are like?
It's in Muppet Christmas Carol
Friglets. They're frog and
because they have
pigs.
Tiny Tim,
Oh yeah, but who plays Tiny Tim?
a little frog.
That's it's fiction within fiction. I think
Uh,
nonfiction. Yes,
And then what would
fiction.
Gonzo be with his weird obsession with like chickens that he always like rounds up a bunch of chickens? So
Zach Lamine.
Interspecies relationship, but maybe can it like this may be stepping on toes, sorry, as the old white guy, but could it be like racial as well as ethnic? The Muppets versus Sesame Street. So you have the race of Muppets, but you have ethnic. You have an ethnicity of the Muppet Show versus the Fraggle Rock and or Sesame Street.
You're really hooked on this Fraggle Rock thing. You've
Yeah,
said it like
yeah.
10 times.
Yeah.
You guys don't even know what Fraggle
I don't even
Rock
know
is.
what you're talking
Is
about.
Fraggle
Rock was
like
on
Dark
HBO.
Crystal?
Dark Crystal.
No, that was a whole nother.
That's
that was
called witchcraft.
Yeah, exactly. No, Fraggle Rock was a show that was on HBO, but it was a Jim Henson show, and it was about these characters who lived in caves and stuff. I don't know. We didn't have HBO. I wasn't allowed, and so we didn't have cable in our neighborhood. So
Sesame Street's on HBO now. HBO owns Sesame Street.
wow,
Wow. Thus Fraggle Rock. Thus Muppets. Thus I win.
there you go. It's the Muppet universe. It's like the Marvel universe.
But that doesn't mean they're related. That's like my whole thing about C.S. Lewis before. Anyways,
All right.
this isn't gonna end. We're just gonna go on this forever.
Right.
How about we talk about the Abide series that we've been a part of for the past 6 weeks?
transition.
Good
Thanks.
transition. Hard right turn.
Yep. And Kevin, tell us about what you talked about.
So I got to take the week of share your resources. Russ, you had an opportunity to talk about share your faith story. As being a follower of Christ, we're called to share our faith stories, whatever that looks like and however you apply that. So I get to talk about share your resources. So really talking about living a life of generosity and as an expression and overflow of our relationship with Jesus. So that's in a nutshell what I talked about last night. Do you want me to go deeper? We can.
Well, I think we should probably start off by at Sanctuary, you mentioned that you had a bunch of stories that you couldn't share. And I feel like you left us
I left you
hanging because it's like
That's
you
like
chose.
every sermon he does, though.
Yeah,
He's
well,
always like,
gotta
I
leave
got
him
3
wanting
stories
more.
I could tell. Then he
Yeah.
looks at the time. Only could tell one.
Yeah. He's like, should I tell the easy one or should I tell the hard one? Well, I only got a certain amount of time. I'll tell the easy one. Well, we want to know what the other story was, and we have the time. So if you wouldn't mind.
You just have to condense it.
I'll try to do that. How long is this podcast? So, well, kind of let me give you the stories behind it. One of the things we talked about last night is having mindsets that affect the way we live. And so I kind of talked about 3 levels of mindsets, and that God is always looking to upgrade our thinking, upgrade our mindsets so that our thinking can look more like his thinking. That we can align ourselves with the way that God believes, thinks, and sees and teaches. And he always wants to free us from unhealthy mindsets, ungodly mindsets that aren't fully kingdom mindsets. And so we talked about, the mindset of the Israelites being held captive in slavery for 430 years in Egypt, right? Their mindset was never enough. We work as hard as we can just to survive, but we never have enough because everything that they had was either taken or controlled. Their resources were largely impacted by the oppressors, by the Egyptians. And that God saved them from that, and they go to the wilderness where it was the mindset then became a dependence on God for just enough. That was learning provision from God's hand, living in relationship with him. And they had just enough, where before they had not enough, never enough. Now they had just enough. But God's ultimate heart was not to keep them in just a provision state, but to move them to a place of promised land thinking, which is more than enough. Therefore, I can share my resources, share the resources that God provided. And so, like I said last night, we've been on a journey of dealing with that. Carrie and I probably have all three mindsets, but we often predominantly live from like a slave or a survival mindset that it was either never enough, it never felt enough. Like, whether we had resources or didn't have resources, we had money in the bank, or we always felt like we didn't have money. There was always this belief or thinking or a mindset or living like we just never have enough, so we have to have more. And we often think that has to do with the fact whether we're poor or we're rich. The answer is you can drive around Fairfield County and there's plenty of people that are rich, they're wealthy, they've got resources, but they still live with the mindset of survival, of never enough. So I need more because I never have enough. And no matter how much you have, you still feel this like it's not enough. And so then the provision mindset. So we've learned to no, we've got a good dad who provides for us. And so learning how to live in that provision, that God will provide for the purposes and callings that are upon your life. So one of the ways was the story that when we first moved to Connecticut in 1998, I was the middle school director here. And we were about to get hired. Actually, I didn't even have the job as a middle school director. And we were moving back to Connecticut, which even then in 1998 was an expensive area to live. We had no money, no savings. No joke. We had maybe $200 in the bank account. Neither one of us had jobs at the time. We didn't have health insurance. We had no credit. We didn't have bad credit, but we had no credit. We didn't own a credit card. And we were trying to find a place to live in Fairfield County. We were looking all over for apartments, and we were praying, God, if you want us here, you've got to provide for us a place to live. Now, Carrie was pregnant with Noah. And so, as a dad, I could sleep on a couch. I don't really care. I can sleep on the ground in a tent. But now I've got a wife, and I want to provide for her. Now I've got a kid, this ultimate responsibility, and I feel like I've got to provide a nice place. But we just kept praying, and someone, an older guy, comes to my parents. He's an 85-year-old guy who's got prostate cancer. His twin brother had just died of prostate cancer. Wow. And he comes to my parents and says, hey, are Kevin and Carrie moving back to Connecticut? Because I've got a house and I wanted to sell it to them. And my parents kind of chuckled, sell them a house? They got nothing, going to McDonald's is a treat for them right now. So they came home but said, hey, Mr. Carlson wants you to go look at his house. And we're like, look at a house? We're trying to find an apartment that we can afford. How are we going to afford a house? And so we met with him and sat down, and he goes, no, I'm moving to Minnesota, and I'm going to live with my daughter, and I'm selling my house. Now, this house, the crazy story is he was the second owner. It was built in 1939. The first guy who owned the house was a Swedish believer who went to the Swedish Baptist Temple, which was in Bridgeport. Ron Carlson bought the house from that guy, who went to the Swedish Baptist Temple. My grandfather was the pastor of that church. So now 3 generations of people that have been Swedish and Baptist have owned this. Now that wasn't in Ron Carlson's thinking. He was like, hey, how can I find a Swedish Baptist person to hang this out to? Not at all. He was just, I don't know, the Lord put it on his heart to ask us if we were. So we went and looked at the house, and it was structurally really sound. It needed a lot of cosmetic work because he hadn't really touched the house cosmetically in 25 years after his wife died. But it was and he offered it to us at a price that was way below market value. But below market value doesn't help us at all when we don't have,
Right.
any, value in our market, we got nothing. And so my grandparents said, why don't you ask him if he would hold the mortgage for you? Because he had paid off the house years before. We're like, hold the mortgage? This guy is 85 years old with prostate cancer. He said, ask him if he'll do it for 5 years. And we're like, 5 years? So anyways, we prayed about it. And when we just told him, listen, we could give you this much money for a down payment, which was not enough for a down payment. But would you be willing to hold the mortgage payment? And the guy said, I'll have to think about that. And he literally turned over to us and said, okay, we can do that. And so God provided for a house that we lived in for 9 years, that our kids grew up in. They still say it's like one of the happiest places they've ever lived.
Wow.
And we've moved a lot. But every place we've lived along the way, God has miraculously provided for us, sometimes at the last minute, in the last hour. But that was probably one of the biggest miracles. There's no way that Kevin and Carrie Butterfield at 25, 24 years old, without any savings, any credit, any money whatsoever, and God provided a house for us.
Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. That really changed our mindsets to really think. We saw the truth in God's word. He's Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. We saw that he did that in the wilderness. We saw how he did that. Jesus promised that to us. But when we had our own encounter with the goodness of God, it changed our mindsets that we knew that God could provide because he had before. Then we had to learn that it wasn't just every once in a while that God provides, that his heart was for us as sons and daughters, that he always provided, maybe not all of the things that we wanted, but everything we needed. Not all the things that we thought would be luxurious or opulent or anything of that way, but he did know the desires of our heart too. And he always took care of us. So that was one of the biggest journeys of our life, was that God was providing for us, especially because in a way that we knew he called us here. And God always provides when we're following his heart. So that's just one story. And so now fast forward to 2020, we're moving back down this way. Houses were being gobbled up like you wouldn't believe during the pandemic, right? For exorbitant prices, like 30% above asking price, which was crazy. People usually had their asking prices, they get 30% below. And we couldn't find a house because either one that we could afford, or by the time they were hitting the market, they were already sold. And so we just kept praying and praying, God, if you're calling us back to Black Rock, we trust that. But when we asked God, it wasn't like begging and pleading God reluctantly. It was like, God, you've done it before, do it again. We did it from a place of trust because we'd seen him do it before. So that's kind of what we just said, God, I don't know how you're going to do this, but I pray that you would do it again. Provide for us. And so we were actually thinking we were going to downsize because our kids are moving out. We're getting older. I say that like we're 90 years old, but we're looking at that next season of life where we should downsize. We should get a smaller house. But God was so good that he provided the right relationship with the right person at the right time, for the money that was below what we thought we could afford or thought we'd have to pay out. And this is the biggest house we've ever owned. The biggest yard. You guys have seen my yard. It is, more yard than I know what to do with. Now that all is to say is, it's just to show us over and over again, but not only us, we tell that story because we want, you guys, and others to hear that story and say, hey, God doesn't care more about Kevin and Carrie than he does about me. So we should have our own stories of seeing God's provision, and even the way that we pray and even the way that we think and we know, Russ, you guys have your own story of God's miraculous provision of housing for you, which was way beyond what you guys thought you were going to be able to get. And again, it's not from a heart posture of going, hey, how opulent can God make my lifestyle? That's not it at all. It's how good is God's abundant blessings in order that we share. Now, we love having people in our house, because God has blessed us with a house above and beyond anything that we could ever deserve. We want people to experience his goodness in our house and be blessed by the house. That it's not our house, it's God's house that he's entrusted to us. So we want to fill it with people and with laughter and hospitality, and in a way that they are having a tangible experience with God's kingdom generosity just by coming in our home, because he provided it for us that way. So those are two massive stories, but those are two stories I was going to share, but ran out of time.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
I think it's cool though, Kev, because I just as thinking like what you just did was kind of doing what Russ talked about and what you talked about of sharing your faith story, right? Because that's something that like me as someone who's 27 who would one day love to own a house is like, man, I hear that story and I'm like, that's really cool. That's something that I can trust. I saw the Lord do it for you.
Yeah.
The Lord can do that for me. But also, I think getting to experience the hospitality that I have received from you and Carrie is also like, man, I look at that and I'm like, I would love when I have my own space, when I have a house, even now in like the apartment I have, like, how do I share the resources that I have with people around me? And oftentimes in the back of my head, it's like, man, how would Kevin and Carrie do it? Because you guys host really well.
Yeah.
And it's done out of, just even hearing you explain, like done out of sharing the resources that you've been given in order to bless people, but also to teach people like, hey, you could do this, So I really appreciate you sharing all that, because I think they fit together so well.
Yeah. And, Russ, you did a great job talking about that everybody, all of us have faith stories that God, big or small. And it's important that we share them, because I do think, that word testimony actually means do it again. And when we share the stories, it gives God glory, but it opens up faith avenues for God to do it again.
Yeah.
And it's not going to look the same. Your faith journey and my journey with this stuff and generosity is going to look different, but God's nature and kindness is the same. And so it's important that we share it. There was one time we were struggling. It was a time where God was meeting our needs, but it felt at times like we were still in lack, or there were going through some circumstances with some things that Carrie and I knew about. The kids didn't fully know about, but we're like, oh, I don't know how God's going to do this. It doesn't seem financially feasible to do X, Y, and Z. And so I remember we went out to dinner. It was this place called Nando's, which is like Portuguese, African Portuguese food. It's delicious, right? And we're sitting at the table, and Carrie goes, hey, let's talk about stories of ways that God has provided for us. And we each just started sharing stories of how God's done it in the past. And the cool thing was it like stirred up faith in us again to go like, oh, yep, we're going through some difficult circumstances right now financially. Paul says, I've learned to be content in plenty and in want. It was in want in that season. But it stirred up faith for us. And actually, it was within like 48 hours that some circumstances had changed and God's provision came in. I don't know what the timing is with that. Maybe actually rehearsing the goodness of God actually stirred up our faith for prayers that actually brought breakthrough. Maybe it was just enough to hold us content and trusting in the Lord before the breakthrough came. But I do know that sharing those faith stories is also part of sharing God's resources. And those two things are connected.
Something you said that I thought was really cool was you said guilt is not. I wrote it down. Guilt into giving is not part of God's plan, or something like that.
Yeah, it doesn't reflect God's heart. And I think, and when I said that, it was really, I've at times felt guilt and shame around finances, resources, giving, whether it's tithing or being generous to others, or, when others talk about, oh, give to this thing, I would often feel guilt and shame, either that I hadn't, and some of that, Russ, is even connected to, worry about what others will think about me.
Sure.
And if I'm not giving the way that others expect that a pastor or a follower of Christ should, or the way that others are giving, there's this guilt of shame of I don't measure up to what is expected of me. Maybe not by God. And maybe some of that is there too, a little disappointment. But, that passage that we looked at last night from 2 Corinthians 9, where Paul is encouraging the church, you should not give reluctantly or out of compulsion, but instead give willingly, because God loves a cheerful giver. So if that's a principle that is true, then why do we sometimes as a church use guilt and sometimes shame, or sometimes maybe an unhealthy and unholy pressure to, let's be honest, and I think we're good about this at BlackRock, but the church, capital C, has used those tactics almost as a manipulation for us to give to what they're doing. That's not God's heart.
Yeah.
Like, we can feel conviction from the Lord that maybe money has a hold of our heart in a way that's not good, or that why am I feeling reluctant to give? Yeah. Is that a heart condition? Is that a relational condition? But God's going, like, I don't want you to do this begrudgingly, as some translations say. That's like Carrie going to me, like, or it's our anniversary, and I buy her a gift, and she's like, "Oh, thanks, Kevin. Thanks for this gift." And I'm like, "Well, I guess I kind of had to. Like, it's our anniversary. I know you were expecting it, and I had to post something online that I gave you something, so I did it out of compulsion about what other people think." Would Carrie walk away going, "Oh, I feel so loved, thanks for that gift, Kevin"? No, she'd be like,
you can take it back.
Exactly. It's not about the gift anymore, right? And probably not a great anniversary for the rest of us, because it's not coming cheerfully. It's not coming willfully. It's coming begrudgingly. And God doesn't want, he wants us to give cheerfully and willingly to him. So we shouldn't use manipulation tactics in order to get people to give reluctantly.
So I think that you said something about also cultivating a lifestyle of radical generosity. And that's something that you've been working on for a long time, like creating this lifestyle. And it's not something that all of a sudden one day you wake up and you're like, wow, I'm going to start being super generous with whatever, just whatever God's blessed me with. And so I was wondering if Andres, you as well, could give some, like, what's it look like to be a college kid or a young adult? And what are some practical things you could do with what you have to start this life of radical generosity?
Yeah, so I was even, when you had said that, Russ, about the guilt part, I was even thinking about the fact that when you think about giving, you almost think like, well, it's not, does it really, at a church like BlackRock, does it really matter if I give $5 a week? Like, what are they going to do with those $5? But it's like, if that's what I can give, because that's all that I have, then like, give it. And know that there is no guilt. Nobody's looking to say, I mean, maybe back when you guys used to pass the plates, it was like, oh,
yeah, who'd put what?
Johnny put a $3, like, really, Johnny?
Yeah, exactly.
But like at this point and where we stand as a church, like, you do everything online, and it's not like Kevin's going through, Sunday night to see who gave what.
Nope.
But it's really like, hey, how can I give what I have that in some way comes at a sacrifice, but at the same time is like, man, I want to faithfully give. So if that looks like, and I've said this before from platform, like, there have been seasons where I've had to say, like, hey, maybe I won't go grab my 4th Starbucks drink this month or this week, honestly, and like give what I would have given for that Starbucks drink to tithe, and like, I didn't have a ton of money in college, but I think even starting off early to say, hey, what does it look like to give just a small percentage of what I make to the church as an active, like, worship to God, because it's what it is. And just training yourself of like, hey, it's okay. And if we really trust that God is provider and he's provided all things, I'm giving back to the Lord what he's already given me, trusting that he will provide for whatever else I need. And I think it's scary to say that when you're like, yeah, but I don't know what I'm going to do. Can I pay gas next week, or can I? But like, I think when we put our radical trust in God to be generous with what we have, like, the Lord meets us in that. And I think, to be honest, and I'm 27, I still spend my money on stupid stuff that I can look back on and like, I could have used that money for something else. I didn't have to go clothes shopping. Did I really have to have Chipotle again this week? Probably not. But I think it takes training yourself. And like, even for me, I can remember being younger. I was actually in youth group, and I remember our youth pastor talking, and he was saying how a story that he had heard of a homeless man who had walked into the church, and they were passing around the giving plate, and he reached into his pocket, and all he pulled out was lint. And the pastor up front happened to say, like, hey, if you don't have anything, you can just put the lint in your pocket and like as a sacrifice, like not a sacrifice, but like that's all he had to give. That's what he gave. And I like something, I don't remember exactly, but something out of it, like this man ended up getting blessed in a way that he had not imagined. And it's not that we give to get blessed,
Right.
but just the heart of like, that's literally all I have, you know, that the Lord honors that and blesses that, I think is one of those things that you just have to wrestle through of like, hey, college student, just give. You probably have $3 to spare. You literally could leave it on the way walking out of the sanctuary. Cause we have the little things
the boxes,
up, right?
Yeah.
Like, and nobody has to see, nobody has to know. You can give online, you know?
And that's the difference, you know, to talk about tithing, you know, we've talked about this. You have to like, from a heart posture of, I am giving, the place I give is the local ministry in which I'm a part of, the local community, which blesses me, and I want to be a part of what God is doing here. But ultimately, what you're talking about, Andres, as far as tithing to the church or giving to the church, it's really giving to the Lord.
Yeah.
And that really is a heart thing, not merely an action. I think there are actions that we should commit to doing, but it is that heart thing, like, and recognize that, hey, I'm not dropping $3 in a plate.
Right.
I'm giving a portion of what the Lord gave to me back to him, and entrusting at that point, when I put it in a box or put it in a plate, it's not up to me what happens with that. And you're right. Andres was like, hey, it's not like they're going to close the door, you know, like, hey, we were $3 short of actually,
Right.
you know, this week or this month, this yearly giving. And we had to shut down all ministries because we were $3 short. But that really is not the point. It's the point of going, am I willing to give to the Lord and to his kingdom work in the world, right? But ultimately it's to him. And I'd say start somewhere.
Yeah.
Start somewhere. And try to make, like, you know, as Zach and I were talking today, there's a lot of times where the Lord has prompted us on our heart to give an offering or a gift that's above our tithe, right?
Yeah.
Or differently than our tithing. And so, you know, and we were talking about that, like, are we only giving when the Lord prompts us to do it? And the answer is no. We've actually made choices to be faithful. And every time we give to the church and out of our tithe, I'm not waiting for a prompting of the Lord.
Right.
I've already made a decision and a choice to do that. That's between us and God. It's what we decided in our hearts, like that passage said, to do. But I'm also recognizing, like, no, I'm giving this to you. I'm giving this to you, Lord. Now, I love the fact of what God is doing here in this ministry, but that's not ultimately what I'm doing. And that's why giving is important to me, is to make sure that my heart is in a posture of, I want to bless the Lord, and I also want to bless the work that he's doing here. Yeah. And so I would encourage, you know, like you said, if it's a college student, if you're going, oh, I'm not even close to 10%. No, 10%, we can talk about that for a long time. We talked about it a little bit last night. You know, how about just start with, can I give the Lord $5 a week?
Right.
Then can I go to 7? Yeah. Can I get to 10? Like, and not reluctantly, but, and also then trust the Lord that he's going to provide for my stuff, and I can't outgive God. So that's been I'd say start somewhere. That's a first thing. Like, if it's $3 a week, that's one less coffee. Not even a good coffee. That's right. A Cumberland Farms coffee, right? That's like, you know,
that's 3 Cumberland Farms.
That's
coffee.
true. That is 3 days of
go.
Cumberland Farm coffee, which, you know, I'm doing you a favor. But like, start there. $3 a week. Can I do that?
You were saying about how you're giving, you're also supporting the ministry. A question that I've come across was there was a time where I was at a church where it seemed like everybody that I talked to that went to this church didn't trust the church leadership. They could see that God was at work in the church and that the Holy Spirit was evident, like people were meeting Jesus, getting saved, and like the church was a productive church. I don't know how else to say it. Like, it was live. It was a live church, an active church, and even in the community. But nobody trusted the leadership. And so it seemed like people were not willing to tithe because like they didn't trust the leadership. And I'm sure that there are people who will listen to this that'll be like, I don't trust the leadership, or I disagree with this decision leadership made. What do you say? What do you say to that?
Mm-hmm. Well, first is a little bit of empathy, because trust is the currency of leadership.
Sure.
And it is really hard to lead well if people aren't trusting you. So it's also indicative on us, as imperfect as we are. And, talking to, 4 guys who are in leadership positions, we will never perfectly lead. And trust isn't binary either. So trust isn't like, so if I ask you, Russ, like, hey, Russ, do you trust me? I can almost guarantee you're going to say yes, partly because I'm your boss and you have to say that. But, you go, yeah, I trust you, Kevin. But if I go, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you trust me? Where's your trust levels with me? You might say a 3. Now I go, oh man, like I need to win your trust over, because I want to be seen as trustworthy and I want to have a relationship of trust with you. Because you will more willingly join, we can be more willingly on mission together when there's greater trust levels. So on some level, I get to go like, hey, if I'm only trusting leadership at, like a 2, I don't want to trust them with my resources. I get that. But at the same time, that's also saying I'm actually giving to those people rather than giving to what the Lord is doing there. And that's hard. I know. I've been in that place. I've been in those situations. And at least for Carrie and I, we had to actually say, okay, are we giving to those people, or are we giving to what the Lord is doing? I'm not responsible for those people. That's the Lord. And I think Scripture's clear on that. That doesn't mean we're all yes men and that like toxic following. That's not what I'm talking about. That's a whole other podcast. But at the same time, am I giving to the Lord? And at that point, that is as far as that's what I'm doing. And I'm either doing that or I'm not. And if I feel like, no, I'm putting this in the pocket of a person that I don't trust, then I'm probably not giving willingly, without guilt or compulsion. Yeah. Now, there's wisdom in there. I know it's a broader topic, but at least for me, there's times where I go, I might not agree with, and what does that mean? Why don't they trust you? They spent money the way that you didn't agree, or where that you didn't think, and you didn't have a say into that. Well, I mean, if you have a church bigger than 2 people, you're not going to have, an equal say on everything, probably. And even, exactly, we have a hard enough time doing that within our family structures.
Right.
And so, there's times I've given my kids money and they spent it in a way that I didn't agree with it. Do I now go, I'm never giving them money again? Do I have a bunch of strings attached to it, or do I need to learn how to empower them on but it's really a heart condition for me. And I go, I get that. I get that it's hard to trust leadership sometimes. They may spend money or do some things or make decisions that I wouldn't agree with. That happens all the time. But ultimately, I'm not giving to them. I'm giving to the Lord. That's how I've worked through that. And so, and if I'm called to be a part of that community, maybe God is calling me to be another part of another community. If I can't trust leadership with my resources, then maybe God is calling me to be a part of a community that I can't trust. Sure. But if I'm on my 10th community because of that, I'm the common denominator in that situation. Right. So maybe I have trust issues. So maybe that's part of it.
Yeah. And I think the cool part, not trying to like pat BlackRock's back and say good job, but I think even here at BlackRock, like I know Sanctuary may not always see it, but like in our annual report, we get a breakdown of where we've spent money, how we've spent money, where money's allocated to. So I think if there is a young adult who is a part of the community that's like, well, I don't know where they spend the money and I don't know, well, what's my money going to? Ask one of us. We will gladly share with you the annual report so you can see all of that, where we put our money last year, where our money's going to this year. I also think too, Russ, even kind of changing your question a little bit, and kind of, I guess not changing it, but answering it a different way, maybe. I've also heard that a lot when it comes to being generous to homeless people. When it comes to like, oh man, like, you know, I've heard people say, I don't want to give money to that homeless person because I don't know where they're going to go and spend it, or I don't, you know, and it's like, okay, but if the Lord's calling you to give that, like, trust the Lord. Let the Lord, you know, like, because I think I've also watched people be stingy with their money because they don't trust what other people are going to do with it. And it's like, yeah, but if the Lord is asking you to give that away, like, trust the Lord in that. I know there's a story that Carrie's told before of a situation happening like that, where the Lord told her to give this woman money, and she was like, I think it was to pay for groceries, and Carrie was like, you sure? And the Lord was like, yeah. And there's an amazing conversation that came out of that.
Yeah.
You know, and I think sometimes we can't allow our own prejudices or our own trust issues get in the way of what the Lord wants to do.
Yeah. And of course there's wisdom in that, you know, where we give and how we give, and God wants us to steward money well. But there's always this link between generosity and trust. So if you're a person that trusts little, you may be generous with a little.
Sure.
So because generosity, and that kind of radical generosity, will always cause you to take risk and to do things that you're uncomfortable with, and that takes trust. It's trusting in the Lord, trusting Him for the results. And, you know, I've told you guys stories, and, you know, we were talking about this earlier, but there were times when the Lord asked us to give, or we were prompted to give, we felt like it by the Lord, where we didn't see a direct result, or sometimes we didn't get the result we thought or we wanted, or we didn't hear the end story of what actually happened with it, but we still had to just trust that God's going to use this. And even if we got it wrong, I think our desire to be generous and join God in His generous heart pleases the Lord.
Yeah.
And He can redeem that. But, you know.
Yeah, I've seen it a lot. I think about, so Gislani is really good at giving away. Like if somebody tells her like, oh, I really like that, they get it somehow. But what's really cool is watching, like, I've also watched the Lord bless her in a way that's like, she'll say like, oh, like, yeah, I was asking the Lord the other day if I could have something like this. Weeks later, I'm talking to her and she's like, oh yeah, so I was doing blah, 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 and someone randomly gifted me exactly what I asked for a couple weeks ago. And it's been so cool to watch, like, but that I like to see someone who's generous with what they have.
Yeah.
But then the Lord be generous to them and bless them. And like, it challenges me in a lot of ways to like, I'm selfish. I like my own stuff. I like my clothing. If someone was like, hey, I really like that shirt, I'm like, that's really cool. I'll tell you where I bought it. Here's the link. I've had Eric, who's one of our interns, one day was like, Andres, I really love that shirt you have. And I said, oh, that's really cool, dude. You can go to H&M. You can pick it up. It was $14. But then like, I think about like someone like Jay, who's like, she'd be like, okay, cool, and give it to them.
Yeah.
Like, but I've seen how the Lord has been generous and giving back, which has been really cool to watch.
You said something, Kevin, about in your heart there was intention to be generous. Like it wasn't some sort of formula. And I think that it almost even like feels like a formula in some ways. Like for Gislani, she's like, when someone says something about how they like this, I'm going to give it to them. Sure. Because she just has that generosity. It seems like that radical generosity lifestyle. Yeah. And that was an intention of her heart where she's like, if someone does this, I'm going to do this. Yeah. Which it's kind of like a formula, kind of goes against what that mindset was. But yeah, like all generosity starts with an intention.
Yeah. And because if you don't make an intentional decision, it's not going to usually pop up, you know, spontaneously all the time. There are a few people that are naturally gifted with a heart of generosity from the time they were kids, and they just live generously like that. Most of us are not that way. Right. Most of us are naturally greedy. Let's be honest. We're selfish. We're self-focused. We're self-indulgent. You know, that's true. We may give, but we're always going to think about ourselves first. Sure. Or it will be out of the overflow, or I have 2 of those shirts, I'll give you 1. Right. that's nice. That's not exactly full generosity. That's like, just going, I've got a spare, so you can have one. That's for a lot of us, that's a good place to start. But
Sure.
we want to get to a place where we're willing. And I think the willingness happens. I'm willing to give to the Lord. And I think there's a lot of people who will say that, like, oh yeah, if the Lord ever asked me to, like Zach said, like this morning, he goes like, how often do I even ask God, do you want me to do this?
Yeah.
I'm willing if he wants to shout in my ear, do this now.
Right.
Like, but I'm also not asking like, hey Lord, should I do this? And that's who I am at times where, but the willingness starts with probably small things, to go back to that thing about a college student or someone who's a young adult or is on a journey of learning how to do this. I think sometimes it starts with like little decisions. Like a little decision that Carrie and I had made is that we were going to be generous tippers. Like when we go to a restaurant or go to a coffee shop or go to any place that there's a tip, does it mean we tip all the time, like in every situation? Well, if we're at a sit-down restaurant and someone serves us, absolutely. That's not even, it's a non-negotiable. And we've chosen at that time that even if the service is horrible, we want to be people that are gracious in our generosity as well. And so even if the service is horrible, we're gonna tip 20%. That was our choice. I'm not saying that's a formula for everybody else,
Right.
but it was a way of being making not a formula, but like an intentional choice of just going, this is who we want to be because it reflects God's heart.
Right.
Because God's gracious and generous towards me many times when I do not deserve it.
Yep.
Actually, I never deserve it. So like that, I want to be that way. Carrie, she made an intentional decision. I was sharing like that, when you go to the grocery store or you go someplace and they say, hey, would you like to round up and donate to whatever that is that they're, collecting for? Or would you like to donate $1 to the food fund or for something like that? Carrie said, every time they ask, I'm going to say yes. Now, it's not because she believes in the charities always that they're giving to. She just said, I want it to be someone who goes, when there's even a little opportunity, I want to just automatically say yes. Now, there were some places in charities that we didn't align with their purposes or their heart, I don't think are kingdom values, that she'd say, I'm not going to give to that. But that's where wisdom comes in.
Sure.
But the intention is, no, I want to do that. So I want to be a person who does that. So it's a small way. And it's usually like rounding up. It's like 37 cents extra, at the grocery store. But just go, no, it's a heart posture of going, yeah, I want to be generous.
Well, and I think that flows from a place of saying, like, I've been given much, like it's not done with the intention of I'm giving this away so that God can give me something. But it's like, no, the Lord has given me much, so I can give this away. Like, is a t-shirt really that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things? No. Like Kevin said, I mean, we have options of clothes to wear.
Yeah.
It's not like this is the only t-shirt I have. But it's really like, hey, the Lord has given me so much, so why should I not give back to him or like give away in a way of saying like, hey, Lord, I'm going to do this in worship to you. And I don't think that it's always right, like, oh, I'll just give this to you, just to give it to you. But done in a way that's like, man, the Lord has given me so much. Why wouldn't I? You want this? Great, have it. Like, I have other things. I don't always need this, and I think that's where we have to challenge ourselves of like, it's not always about even in the receiving. Because I think what you were saying, Russ, of like, I think sometimes even in Christian world, we make it into this like, well, if I give this, then the Lord will give me this, or the Lord will bless me with this.
Yep.
So even someone listening to this can be like, oh, you guys are what do they call it? Prosperity gospel. There we go.
Yeah, we talked about that last
Right,
time.
right. Of like, of, even listening to us and like, oh, well, you guys are talking about, giving away and the Lord blesses. And it's like, yeah, but it's not about, I don't give away because the Lord blesses. I give away because the Lord has blessed me.
Yeah.
So
I've already been blessed.
Right. I've already been blessed by the Lord. So I want to give away what he's given me.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we have to kind of change that mindset of like, I'm not doing this so the Lord can do this or so I can somehow, like I have any power, stronghold the Lord into doing what I want. Yeah. I'm doing it because God has blessed me with much so that I can give away much.
I was even thinking for like that young adult or that student out there to know that you could also be generous with things that you'll just receive right back. Like Daniel Tiger, You like Bluey, so I know you're not. You're not. A Daniel Tiger guy.
I'm a Bluey guy. I'm not Daniel Tiger.
But Daniel
guy.
Tiger sings that you could take a turn and then I'll get it back.
Can you sing it?
You could take a turn and then I'll get it back. That's the whole song. He just keeps saying it over and over again.
I love it.
And it's way better than Bluey. Just as a side note,
I don't think so.
Bluey doesn't have songs that are that catchy.
They
But
do.
the whole point of this, let's not fight again.
I do think a tiger could take Bluey.
Yeah,
But anyways, that's another.
That's right.
That's another topic.
he's correct.
Okay.
Anyways, keep going.
Where was I going?
I don't know. You were the one talking.
Giving in order to receive, or
So you can be generous with things that you're not going to lose forever too. Like a T-shirt, like that could be a little dangerous to lend out if someone's like a coffee drinker or like messy. You get it back with like an avocado stain on it that's never coming out. But something like a skateboard or something. I know it sounds like something a child would use, but this was something from when I was in college, lending out my longboard for people to like use out on the town and stuff. Or cars. That's pretty trustworthy, insurance and all that.
That's a big one.
That's a big one, but you're going to get it back.
Well,
some conditions.
Wait. Because Kev, you've done that before. What? I mean, because I love my car.
Yep.
I'm still paying off my car. My car's like my baby.
Yep.
How have you even gotten yourself to a place? I've heard you offer people before, like, hey, if you just need my car for a couple days while yours, and like, what got you to that point? I know you've talked about, you guys taking small steps, but like, to me, that's a big step. I don't even want people driving my car now with me in the car.
Because it's a high risk.
Right.
Like, it's a high risk, really low return.
Right.
You're like, someone's going to say thanks, and they might not even bring it back with like gas in it.
Sure.
Yeah. It's been a journey for sure. Obviously there's wisdom in who and when and how, but I think when we've seen God over and over be just so gracious in providing for us, I'm going to get teary here. Like, how could I say no? Again, where wisdom isn't like shouting not to, or the Lord's not saying like don't do it, but in a general principle, it's how I want to say a giant thank you to the Lord's provision to me. And we've learned a principle that I can't unpack fully here, but there's a principle of flow in the kingdom. And it's this: as God gives to us, we want to create a flow to give to others. And we want to receive with our left hand and give with our right hand. We want, because if not, then it becomes a pond where everything just collects.
Sure.
And ponds are great, but they become stagnant. And if it stays stagnant for too long, that's bad. We want to be, so if I can receive God's goodness on small levels, then I want to be able to give it. But I've received God's goodness on massive levels. I want to be able to give it away. And, we may say, hey, do you want to borrow a car? There's still something in me that times that goes like, oh, did I just say that? Or like, wait, what if they, but even if they crash the car, who gave me the car to begin with? The Lord did. And so can I trust the Lord to give me, another car? Well, maybe. And maybe it'll be a different car. Maybe I won't have a car for a while, but he's good. And, and I can look at it and go, well, if I have to drive in a car, just if we have to be a one car family, we've been there before. For out of the 8 years we were in Australia, I think 6 of the years we were a one car family. And it was a pain in the neck at times because we were driving all over the place, but it also was a lot of family time. So I could look at it that way. We spent a lot of time in the car. We had a lot of good conversations in the car together. So I think it's been a journey in learning how to do that. But recognize it's not my car anyways.
Sure.
My name's on the title sometimes. But it's the Lord's car. And the Lord's taking care of us. But I will also say we've had to learn to pray in a certain way. And there's certain prayers that I pray out, not as just like a formulaic say that God, you have to answer this prayer. But sometimes it's a heart posture where I've it's in prayer and just say, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. And I'll just follow that up. That's Psalm 23:1. Lord, we ask, you are our shepherd, and we want you to shepherd our lives. And we ask that you would continue to provide for everything we have need. And we also, I can't receive from the Lord that which I'm not willing to give away. I can only give away what the Lord's given to me. Yeah. And just learning how to do that in small ways. Like, that's where tipping, I mean, it sounds like it's just one little thing that we want to be a blessing to people around us, that whether they deserve it or not, we want to be people. And I've had to learn, like, I may never see that server again, but I want to bless them. I want to walk away going like, oh, I reflected God's heart in that. So
that's good.
But don't be generous with your money, but then be stingy with your attention and affection. Like, I see people go to restaurants and maybe they tip 20%, but they treat their treat their servers, their waitresses or waiters, like garbage. Yeah. Like, that doesn't compute. Like, the Lord wants us to cheerfully give our encouragement and our, when we go to a restaurant, we're not like, can you get me a Coke? That's so rude. I wouldn't talk to my dog that way. Like, well, maybe lady, but
lady.
but I'd say, hey, when you get a second, I'd love to have another Coke if you can do that for me. Yep. That's just being generous with their time too, and honoring who they are. So yeah, part of that's even, some people are willing to do that, but not to give. Like, sure. It's both. It's hand in hand.
Yep.
Or generous with their time too. Some people are like, oh, I'll give you a lot of money, but I'm not giving you my attention.
Yeah.
Well, then you're being greedy with your attention too.
Yeah.
I was going to say just a quick note about that psalm that you referred to, because my dad has this geography of Israel book. I don't know. I've talked about this once before in a service where he's telling me about his geography of Israel book that he's going through, and it was kind of lame, but there was a couple parts that were really interesting. And one of the parts was about, I guess, based on the evidence they could find, where David would have been when he wrote that. The Lord's my shepherd, I'm like, I shall not want, I have everything I need, whatever. Is that he was in this like completely barren landscape. And every time I read that passage, I assumed that he was in some sort of like lush field,
green field, yeah.
And he had like everything provided with, because he could see it all right in front of him. He's like, oh, you lead me beside these still waters, right? He's like yeah. He's looking at it or something, and he's seeing his provision right in front of him. But from what they're saying in this book is that he was standing in this barren landscape with nothing and his sheep that he's supposed to be taking care of. And I think that's the season that a lot of us find ourselves in, when it's like we can see the lack in our lives and we don't see that provision, kind of like that desert mindset you were talking about. But God has this promised land ahead of us that he's going to provide everything that we need, but it's hard to keep that in the forefront of our mind when we're surrounded by the barren desert.
Yeah.
Well, and even I think as young adults in Fairfield County, like, that's hard to, because I think the barren wasteland or whatever it might be also looks like my friend who's my age, who's living in a really nice apartment, driving a nice BMW, right, making 40, 50, 60 grand more than me.
Is that me?
Yes, it is actually.
Talk about me right now.
And you look.
We've seen your cargo van.
Rough.
It's not a cargo van.
It's a family van.
It's a minivan.
That's true.
Sorry for interrupting you.
It's okay. But I think it's easy even to look at that and go, well, I don't have enough. I don't have what my friends have. I don't have, the great things that they do, or I don't go on the great vacations they go on, and to find yourself in this state of like, Lord, I don't have what I need. And really challenging yourself to like, no, you might not have what you want, but do you really have what you need? Has the Lord really provided for you in a way that is exactly what you need, exactly where you are? So I think even challenging ourselves as young adults, because it can feel that way. I'd love to have a house right now. I'd love to have, these different aspects of life that people should have at our age, right? But we don't. Some of us don't. So how do you really wrestle with like, yeah, but has the Lord given me everything that I need? And can I be content in that? Because it's hard where we live. And I think, especially when you come out of college, I remember coming out of college and thinking life was going to be so easy and I was going to have all these things. And I got out of college and I moved in with my parents into my high school bedroom, and I lived there for 3 years. That's not what I was expecting. And again, I had friends who were living in the city, and we've talked about hyper reality. And you look at what they post on Instagram and it's like, oh my gosh, they're living these amazing lives in the city. And you look at that and you're
Every
like,
day's an adventure.
right. And you're like, why don't I have that? Because that's the life. But really the life that I'm living with Jesus, although, yeah, it's not always everything that I want, it is everything that I need. And learning how to be content in what the Lord has given. That's been something for me, as you were speaking of, just like learning to be content with what the Lord has given me, and realize like, man, I really am blessed because of that.
And I will say, as a dad, I wanted to give my kids everything because I want to make them happy. But I quickly learned as a dad, giving my kids more didn't make them more happy. Indulging my kids' desires didn't make them more joyful or thankful or grateful. I've got great kids. That's not what I'm not denigrating my kids. I'm just saying because, and so we often think that way too, that if I have more, I would be more happy. Or that if God really cared about me, he would give me everything I want, all the desires of my heart, without delighting in him first and without living in relationship with God. And I've learned, and I'm not, I'm not anything close to being a good father like our Father, the Father. But if that's true, like I had to learn as a dad, no, like I need to be able to provide for my kids. That's my job. That's my role, right? As parents, I want to provide everything that my kids need. But I also need to help my kids have what they need, when they need it, and how they need it, while still shepherding their heart and heart connection with me. And that's really our relationship with the Father too. And I will say that as the Lord sees us be out of relationship with him, that our hearts are reflecting his, he can entrust us with more resources for ourselves, because we're not depending on them for our contentment, like watching everybody else in our world. But then we'll also begin to share. Like there's nothing more joyous as a parent than when you give, one kid, like if I give Noah, if I gave Noah, 2 pieces of candy, that he grabbed one and turned to Hannah and said, here, you can have this. That because then I'm going, oh, I can trust him with more because he'll do the right thing with it, or he's reflecting my father's heart by giving away to his kids. I think the Lord is sometimes waiting for us not to have an abundance before we give, but to start sharing with what we have now. That the Lord goes, oh, I can trust you. You can handle being generous to other people without being greedy or without overwhelming, or without trusting, or without hoarding for your own happiness. And I think that that's so important. I'll never forget being in Rwanda, one of my trips there. And I would encourage anybody to go into a different culture or a different place, or work with different people that have less, that if we're struggling with that hyper reality comparison, because it reshifts your priorities and your thoughts and your thinking and your view of yourself and the Lord. But I remember being in Rwanda, and we had blow pops, the lollipops with the gum inside of it. And we brought a whole bunch just to hand out to kids and, just as a fun thing. We were there to bring other resources and so on. But, and I remember they were working with kids who didn't speak English. They only spoke Kinyarwanda. And one of us pulled out a blow pop and gave it to there was like 5 boys that were there. and we gave one blow pop to one of the kids. Now we're talking amongst ourselves to say who's got more blow pops. Now, by the way, on that trip, we saw miraculous provision that every time we needed a blow pop, we had enough. I know that we gave out way more blow pops than we brought with us. I don't know how God provided or multiplied it, but it was one of those miraculous things. It was like loaves and fishes. And we always had just enough. Everywhere we went, we're like, if there were 17 kids, we had 17 blow pops, and we don't know how it happened. But I remember giving it to this one kid, and while we're hunting for 4 more blow pops to give to the rest of one, he doesn't know that's what we're saying. He thought we just gave them one. He took off the wrapper and licked it, and then gave it to his friend, who licked it, who gave it to his friend, and licked it. Now, from a germaphobe's perspective, it was a nightmare, right? Like, but none of us were like saying, "Oh, that's gross." We were like, "That's generosity. That's sharing." That was like, I was over the moon with that, because I knew if I was in a different place and I brought out one lollipop, there would have been 4 kids who were pummeling the one kid with the lollipop to get it, or looking at us and going, "Where's my blow pop?" A sense of entitlement rather than generous and sharing. And I think God is looking for people like us with, whether it's a blow pop or a 6-figure income or a car or with whatever, that he goes, that we're looking around going, how can I share what God's given? How can I enjoy it and share it with others? And that's really the Father's heart, So, I think that's really, it's always a heart question, whether I will be greedy or stingy, self-indulgent, or I'm willing to be generous. And it starts with little decisions. That's where we are. And encourage each other. Tell God stories of his provision. And also, when we've given and we've seen God use it, great. And we could also tell some stories of going, it's a little frustrating, but let's keep praying for God's, to God use it no matter what.
Yeah.
I think that's where we'll end for today, being that the goal is that we pray for opportunities to be the blow pop kid.
That's right.
And that we'd see it in this week and the months, years to come, that we'd start facilitating this life of this radical generosity, but starting with the little things like sharing a blow pop.
Yeah.
Kevin and Andres, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Thanks for your wisdom. And we'll see you next week again.
Yes.
Again.
Keep it going.
Let's keep it up.
Awesome.
Thank you, Zach.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, feeling good, like I should. When in dark, walk around the neighborhood. Feeling blessed, never stressed. Got that sunshine on my Sunday best. Yeah. Hey, every day can be a better day despite the challenge. All you gotta do is leave.